Hi, folks. Pleasure being here. I really hope that the next 40 minutes will be really interesting for you folks because it's really something I'm really proud of, and I'm really happy that sort of seeing in action. And I think this can be a real game changer in the industry. So let's get started. First of all, a little bit on who I am. Well, my name is ChristoferDutz. I'm a senior software engineer at a company called Mapped. I've always been and still are a real open source enthusiast. So all of my free time really goes into all sorts of different open source projects, most of them at Apache. That has sort of made me a committer and member of a lot of the open source projects we have there. I'm also the initiator and currently acting vice president of the Apache PLC4X top level project. And if you want to hear what I'm sort of working on, and sometimes a little sort of like just distraction, fun stuff, just follow me on Twitter. Also on LinkedIn, that's where I sort of post a bit more serious and a little lengthy stuff. So I'd be happy to see you there too. So let's get started with this talk. So let me jump over here so I don't get in the way. So what I'm going to be talking about is sort of how was the industry in the, let's say, industry 3.0 times? What's changed in the 4.0 times that we're currently living in? What are the challenges the industry is facing with these changes? And how the industry is currently solving these problems? Yeah, so they are solving the problems, but I'd say I'm not in a really great way. So I'm going to be talking about what I think is actually wrong with these and how we can do it better. And in the last part, I'm going to be showing you or talking about how we did things better and a little outlook on what's still missing to sort of make this wide-scale adoptable. So we're talking about this sort of stuff. We're not going to be talking about these little home setups where somebody has a PLC or two, or well, let's say even 10. It's sort of not even my demo factory that some of you might have seen is sort of applicable for this sort of thing that we're talking about. So we're talking about these big ones there. So what was in the 3.0 times? Well, in general, people say 3.0, Industry 3.0. That was the time when sort of PLCs entered the stage. SCADA systems came up. These are usually machines automated with PLCs. Most of them are sort of autonomous, so they're not connected. It's sort of like just sort of the PLC is just controlling the machine and maybe has an HMI, a little display where you can sort of push some buttons. Sometimes it's really just like on the old Enterprise, you have these real turn knobs and big push buttons. Not much more. Some, the bit bigger ones, they're usually connected to SCADA systems. Usually they belong to the, or are from the same vendor as the PLCs because, well, that's the way things worked in those times. They were all proprietary and closed source software. And, well, data acquisition in general was only done for, well, operation. Well, you sometimes need to get some telemetry in order to know how to operate your machinery. Well, and sometimes for documentation. There are some regulatory rules. For example, one that's particularly, let's say, intense is the US FDA regulations, the US Food and Drug Administration. So if you're selling anything to the US, well, you have to apply to those rules. And well, if you want to sell any food and drugs on the US market, you have to follow those. And, well, these regulations require you to sort of keep track of some important data and telemetry. So in general, in these times, you can think of the internet wasn't a real problem because it wasn't really a firewall like on this picture, but they were just not connected. They weren't sometimes even connected with each other. You had separate machines, and they were just talking to themselves or their neighbors. So security really wasn't that much of a problem. Um, but, well, this has changed because with Industry 4.0, systems started or had to become interconnected. More and more new software was used because, well, let's face it, if you want to go into machine learning, in the beginning, the automation industry didn't have anything. So if you wanted to start with that, well, you had to go for existing solutions, and most of those were open source. I think the most obvious thing is, well, if you want to get your production data into the cloud, well, you sort of have to connect your production network with the internet in order to get it into the cloud. Data acquisition, well, now it's more excessive because, well, we still need data required for operation of the machinery or for the already mentioned documentation cases. But we also want to run analytics on our machines. How is the utilization of my machines? How can I optimize that? For predictive maintenance, for machine learning, you need sort of 100 times the data amount you had when you only just wanted to fill some, let's say, spreadsheet for documentation purposes. There are a lot more use cases, and it sometimes feels like every day a new use case comes up. But let's face it, all of those require data, and lots of it. So, these are the challenges that we're now facing because now our machines are connected to the internet. And while it was still possible to sort of like in the past, I think all of you heard about that Stuxnet situation where the Iranian nuclear enrichment plants were attacked. That wasn't a typical internet hack, so sort of that was an on-premise thing where you really had to know the hardware. So you weren't really 100% safe in the 3.0 times. But let's face it, in the 4.0 times, when things are connected to the internet, well, it's a lot easier. You sometimes don't even have to leave your office. So this is currently the threat the industry is most scared about. It's sometimes, most of them are talking about industry espionage, but in general, what they're probably most afraid of is that sort of some attacker comes in and actually breaks something. And I mean, things can really go bad when we're talking about industry machinery. And why is this a problem? Well, let's say the OT departments are totally new to these outside challenges. And OT means operational technology. And it's sort of like the equivalent of, well, in the classical IT, we have the IT department. They do all the networking, installing stuff, maintenance of software. Well, and the OT guys are the ones taking care of the industrial automation networks, the PLCs, and stuff like that. And, well, because they're new to these outside challenges, well, let's say the administration is sort of a bit naive. Because they can only protect against things they know about. And let's say a few examples of where this is problematic. For example, a lot of automation systems are accessible from the internet. It's probably not that they wanted to do it that way. On the next slide, I'll show you a little numbers on that, or an impressive map. Sometimes the automation industry came up with password protection that just doesn't work. My favorite example is Siemens S7 devices. They have this little thing where you can sort of flick or a checkbox in your TIA automation engineering software, and then it's know-how protected. Well, the thing is, you need a password in order to sort of read out the software or change it. But the strange thing is, well, the way they implemented the password protection was sort of like the engineering software connects to the PLC, checks in the PLC if there's a little flag set. If it's set, well, they ask for a password, and then they compare the hash with a hash stored in the PLC, and only if that matches, they continue to work. Well, this is a great protection as long as you're actually using the TIA portal engineering software. But if you're sort of like just reading out stuff, well, there is no protection at all. And another thing, if you enable the OPC stack on these machines, well, you can turn on authentication. Then you need a username and password in order to connect to that via OPC But well, if you don't have the password, well, just fall back to S7. That doesn't have that mechanism, and you can access the machine the same way. In other cases, I've seen password protection where the password is transmitted in clear text. It's not even encrypted. So one case I've seen here was the Beckhoff ADS protocol. They have a sort of, well, it's sort of not the ADS protocol. It's sort of the tooling around it. And we've seen that if you use the engineering software and you say, oh, please set up an AMS route, well, it uses some undocumented protocol, well, and you can see admin usernames and passwords transmitted in clear text. So that's one of the reasons we're not going to be supporting that, because actually using it is really dangerous. So the only real secure option for protection is simply not to connect. And I promised you the thing with accessible from the internet. Well, I just had a look just 2 days ago, and I'm using a search engine called Shodan. It's sort of like a search engine for open ports on the internet, and you can get a little more information on it. I have never in my life connected to any of the devices listed there, and I strongly suggest nobody of you does that either, because first of all, there's a legal risk. Well, you could be sued, but I think the most problematic thing is the risk for the lives of people. And I'm not just talking about, well, there is this one machine that breaks. There are sometimes even oil tankers whose control systems can be accessible without any protection. A good friend of mine has a lot of these dangers with IoT things here in Germany. So I really strongly suggest you not do that. But I think I still like this tool because it shows me that, for example, this is a search. I did it intentionally with Modbus, as I know that, especially in Asia, Modbus is sort of like a pretty dominant protocol. And each of these red dots, are industrial machinery with open Modbus connectivity that are freely available on the internet. And as Modbus doesn't have any means of protection, well, I think there's a lot of danger you could do, or damage you could do there. Some numbers. In total, well, let's say the US seems to be leading with this, but 55,000 machines available on the internet. That's a lot. As I mentioned, they could be coffee machines, but they could also be something like this. And this is probably sort of, if you think, well, messing around with a power plant, and this is intentionally not a nuclear one. I hope it's not a nuclear. I hoped it was a coal one. Because I think you can imagine a lot of things can happen there, but I've seen the industry actually not being that terrified in those sections. The parts where it really gets sort of the danger zone is sort of the parts where you're really getting into trouble if you've got issues like this, as, well, let's say something like this. And I chose this image not because sort of I'm German and I just sort of love beer, but it's because it's sort of food. It's a food and drug production line. And as I mentioned, the Fda regulation usually is a lot stricter than everything that is sort of non-nuclear food and drugs. For example, without hesitations, customers let me sort of connect to all of the PLCs of a production line of one of the major German car manufacturer production lines. There were no issues with me connecting with those machines. But when it came to sort of like a pharmaceutical, chemical, or food and drugs, then I was only allowed to sort of like connect to demonstration machinery. So how does the industry currently solve these problems? Well, I think you could sum it up. It all comes down to sort of like they just invest a lot of money. It seems like they're just taking a huge pile of money and throwing it at the problem. At least it feels this way. And I have to admit, one money bag is just not enough. And it actually sort of feels more like this. This is just totally silly, the prices I've seen in the industry. If I just sort of like have a look at the licenses I've paid for in the last year, well, let's say if I take the JetBrains All Products pack, I'm sort of at 650 euros or something like that. Well, if you're a longtime customer like I am, it's probably a lot less, but let's just assume 650 euro. Well, that's okay. If you go for a Siemens TIA Portal professional engineering license for programming S7 devices and other Siemens devices, well, you're already at 3,500 euros or something like that. That's still not that bad. If you got to update, there was recently a sort of a security vulnerability, and Siemens told everybody to update their devices. Turns out the ones I have are vulnerable too, and in order to update them, I have to get a Siemens SD card. It has to be Siemens formatted, otherwise, they say it doesn't work. I had a look. There's a 32 gigabyte SD card available for $1,000, 1,000 euros. Couldn't resist naming this because I just thought it was ridiculous. But it's still not really crazy. Really crazy, it comes to cases where you have to use validated software, audited and validated software for data acquisition. Because when it comes to this, I've seen license costs of around 100,000 euros per year to just get 10,000 data points out of some production line. And when we're talking machine learning, you're at 10,000 data points pretty fast. So how does how does one of the solutions I've actually seen look like? Well, it's sort of like this. You've got a chain of systems. You can see at the beginning you have sort of the PLCs. They communicate with a SCADA system. This is sort of like the basic things. Usually these SCADA systems have internal databases. So in this case, they had to sort of export the data into an MS SQL Server database because that was, the only supported one. Then they had some sort of SAP system that took data from the SQL server and did some SAP number crunching stuff with it, and then pumped it to an Oracle database. This was all still in the secure production network. So if they wanted to get data out, they had to buy this 100,000 and more euros expensive software, which was validated and audited software that was able to access this data in the secure network. And when it comes to this validated and audited software, it's sort of like the company or the company has to sort of hire a professional to explicitly verify each line of code you have in your product in order to certify that it has no side effects and that it's not possible to access or to do any damage. And this is the main reason why it's so insanely expensive. This validation audit, it takes so much time, it's so much effort, and it's just insane. And on the outside, as soon as there was data on the outside, they were storing it in some historian. And that you can just think of some really, really, really old SQL database. All in all, it sort of like just feels like sort of chaining stuff together and sort of like, yeah, it's just not a pretty solution. But, well, some companies sort of didn't want to do that. And so I've even seen this as a solution. So they use bicycle messengers to give hard drives a ride through the company location. They did that because it was a lot cheaper. They didn't have any problems getting budget for a bike and somebody to ride the bike. And you would be really amazed how many companies actually have these bike messengers riding around with hard drives in them. This I found after sort of one of our mapped lock-picking community events. And I noticed, oh gee, sometimes it's really easier to pick an industrial protocol than it is to pick a lock. So I just out of fun, I Googled, is there sort of a physical lock for network devices? Yeah, well, and Siemens already has a solution for that. So I also couldn't resist showing you this one because I actually think sometimes this is actually one of the really good solutions. So, all in all, you can say, well, there is no open source involved in the current solutions to these problems because it's not validated software. Validation, as I said, it would require validation of the code, but in our case, or in case of open source, well, we would also have to validate all of the dependencies of the project. And I think everyone who's ever built sort of a typical Maven-built open source project, well, it's more than just one library you're pulling in. And validating all of these would just be insanely expensive. It would take an enormous amount of time, and it would completely kill the drive of an open source project because we would be going down from weeks of release cycles to years. And despite nobody really wanting to pay for that, we needed to come up with a different solution. And being faced with this sort of like knockout criteria of, well, is your software validated? And I always had to say, well, no. And then usually I was out of the race. I had to come up with a new solution. So what in general do I think is wrong with these? Well, first of all, I think the data flow through several systems, well, it adds a lot of latency. As soon as there are a lot more parts in the picture, there's a much higher risk of system outages. There is a much higher risk of conversion errors because every time sort of maybe there's some data correction, some mapping done, it's sort of like the data coming out at the end of the pipeline, it's not guaranteed to be identical to the one that came in. Data corruptions, well, maybe some of the solutions in between just isn't doing its job correctly. And, well, complexity kills innovation because in this one case, the company had the problem that they had data scientists and they wanted to work on data because, well, that's what data scientists sort of do. So every time they wanted a new bit of data, 4 or 5 systems had to be adjusted. And also, well, let's say the expenses kill innovation. If you want to sort of optimize your production to sort of be sort of save you 50,000 euros in production costs each year, well, if you have to pay 100,000 euros of license costs, well, it just doesn't sum up. And, well, in the end, it still doesn't guarantee safety. Because now you might be thinking, oh, well, but every line of code has been validated and audited. How can this not be safe? Well, I think all of you have heard in the last few years these exploits like Meltdown and Spectre. Well, the thing is, even if those might not directly be sort of a good vector for attacking such validated software, but in general, what I want to point out is that sort of if you sort of get to compromise the hardware or the processors your software is running on, it's just no good to sort of rely on being validated and audited because, well, maybe you can just change what's happening underneath. And for example, Meltdown Inspector. All Intel processors were vulnerable that were produced in the last 20 years. So, how can we do it better? And in the background, you can see our project mascot Toddy and his new best friend Gopher sitting in my little demo factory that I built last year. So, how can we do things better with Apache PLC4X? Well, I'd say we need more open source in the industry. And the thing I tried with what I'm going to be talking about is a sort of like not concentrating on how everybody did things before, but to more concentrate on their desired outcome. So the desired outcome is, well, we want to get data out. And we don't want to open a door for getting in. So, and the solution we came up with in the end were passive mode drivers. What is a passive mode driver? Well, first of all traffic is forwarded to a listening agent. This passive mode driver running on the agent intercepts all requests, response messages, subscription requests, and event messages. And it sort of like just figures out, well, here's a request with a given ID, and here's a response. Well, they seem to belong together. So this is probably going to be the question, and this is going to be the answer for it. So we're able to sort of like have the same information that is available as if it was asked directly. And the tricky part is sort of like joining those together. With requests and responses, well, it's not too difficult because, well, it's sort of like in most protocols, in the request, you describe what you want, and in the response, you just have to decode it. But when it comes to subscriptions, it's a bit more difficult because you have to sort of like intercept the subscription that might be happening quite some time before an event comes in. So you have to keep track of all the subscriptions. And these might even change over time. So you have to keep track of that. And sort of in order to know how to interpret those responses. You can also sort of on these, you don't have to forward all of the traffic because that sometimes can be quite excessive. You can also just sort of like filter certain protocols or certain ports or just certain hosts. But all in all, well, that's the general picture. But how do these ensure we're actually safe? Well, first of all, a passive mode driver, it doesn't ask any questions. So if there's a passive mode driver in there or not, there is absolutely no difference to the PLC or the control system because there's just no information coming out from the inside. With regular active drivers, well, even if you think, even with read requests, it's pretty easy to completely shut down a PLC by just asking it too many questions. And passive mode drivers don't ask questions, they just listen, so it's just impossible to interfere. But how can we ensure things are safe on a hardware level? Well, what we usually do is we use a managed switch with a monitoring port that's just configured to not allow incoming traffic. For a lot of cases, this might be sort of okay. But some people still don't trust vendors of network hardware. So what we can do is we can add one layer. And that's one thing I call a data diode. And I'm going to be talking about that in a few slides. But all of this makes it really hard to interfere with the network. It doesn't make it impossible because in that one particular case where we wanted to use it, that still wasn't enough. Because even if technically the firmware of the device was perfect, you couldn't sort of prevent somebody from just putting high voltage on this Cat5 cable and just frying everything in the production network. So if you just add an optical link, well, that's another problem you can sort of take out of the equation. And with sort of a data diode combined with an optical link, I think it's really almost impossible to sort of interfere from the outside. And the good thing is, as your software isn't sort of like asking any questions, and it is guaranteed to sort of not have any interference with the inside network, well, there's no real need to validate the software. The system is what we call secure by design. And the good thing is it's also insanely fast. More on that on the showcase I'm going to be talking about later. And one thing, if you imagine still, let's say if we're using the data diode, still you have to sort of trust this, but validating hardware is a lot easier than validating the program for a software. So if you want to validate the circuitry and the firmware of that data diode, it's a lot less code. It's a lot easier. It's a more general purpose. So it's a lot cheaper and it's a lot more secure. So this is sort of the big picture of what we came up with. So in the end, we have the PLCs talking to the SCADA system just like they were unchanged. We configured the monitoring port, attached a data diode, and on the outside we had sort of a Raspberry Pi running a PLC4X passive mode driver. And this was just happily intercepting the data in the data center and passing along the decoded information, and we'll store it in an IoT database. So now you may say, well, in the beginning I said not every system has a SCADA system. Sometimes they are just sort of like maybe just connected and the PLCs are talking to each other, or sometimes they're not connected at all. Well, that's also not really huge of a problem because in this case, for example, we just add a switch with a monitoring port if they weren't connected at all, and it's really easy to sort of like just have a simple application that's running in the secure network that's just pulling the information that we want to make available outside. This doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a SCADA system. You could use Apache PLC4X for this if you sort of worried because that's not certified, and this would actually be communicating with the industrial hardware, where there are a lot of commercial solutions that have a lot lower price tag than the original solution to sort of like just pull some data. As I promised, the data diode, here's a little picture of one of the devices. This is a device that was explicitly built for Apache PLC4X. It was built by a company called Wiesemann & Theis in Germany. I added the web URL here if you're interested, and the product name is a fixed defined firewall. And here we're talking at a unit price of 530 euros per unit. And this device was explicitly the result of a talk I gave at a meetup. And after that, the CEO of Wiesemann & Theis approached me, and we had a really interesting chat. And after this chat, well, I was really amazed that 1 week later, I got contacted by their development engineers. And I think 2 months later, I got the first device. And what this thing does, it's sort of like you link it between the uplink port and an external device, and it sort of acknowledges the Ethernet frames on both sides, so they appear to be live connections. But what it does, it just forwards packets from the secure network to the insecure network and drops everything from the insecure network into the secure network. It's as simple as it can get. And I guess they can even be made a lot cheaper if more are sold. And they're currently not validated hardware, but they promised if the numbers of sales go up some more, that this will be the next thing they will be aiming for, sort of certifying that this is sort of validating the software. So, as I mentioned, we did a little showcase, and I'm unfortunately not allowed to disclose who it was, what we actually did, or what the machinery did in detail, but I was allowed to sort of like talk about sort of the general problem and the general solution. So pharma production, as I mentioned, FDA rules apply, and this makes it very challenging. So the company had wanted to sort of like have data scientists optimize the production to have better quality, less sort of machine outages, sort of less not correct production. But unfortunately, everything they wanted to do would have completely been eaten up by the license cost. They were using a Delta V SCADA system. As I said, this sort of like chain of 4 to 5 systems, adding a new data point and adjusting 5 to 6 systems or 4 to 5 systems, it was sort of a huge configuration overhead. So the objective was getting out data cheaper, getting it out securely, so we didn't want to open any doors, getting out data fast, because this chain of pumping data from one end to the other, it's sort of, we're not talking about real time now anymore. Sort of like, well, you can view the data of a few hours ago, but real time, completely out of the question. And it should be, we want to get out data reliably. Yeah. So what we came up with, well, I sat there for 2 weeks with a training setup, and I reversed sort of a driver for the Delta V system that was able to sort of like run in a passive mode. We put that code on a Raspberry Pi, connected that to the management port, or to the monitoring part of an industrial switch. And all of the data that sort of like came out of that was pumped into a timescale DB. Probably today I would have used Apache IoTDB, but well, when we did that proof of concept, well, IoTDB didn't yet exist at Apache, so I didn't have it on my radar. In the end, we just slammed a Grafana dashboard on top of that. Yeah, and this complete solution, sort of like, you just plugged it in, and there was no configuration at all, so nothing was happening. Everything that the software did was just observe what was happening, and it was completely configuring it itself. I was the first to sort of actually seem to be, I think I was the first person to sort of like be able to reverse engineer the Delta V protocol, because I think I have been contacted about this by so many people off list, so there is definitely some interest in this. The load on the Raspberry, it was almost not existent. So it was sort of like just doing regular Raspberry maintenance stuff. The load on the monitoring system, as I said, there was no additional load on the system because, well, if you don't ask questions, you don't cause work. And one of the fun things was that actually when we changed sort of the machinery, the telemetry updated in the Grafana dashboard almost instantly, while the official SCADA system, it took 2 or 3 seconds to sort of like update. And all of this in total, because we didn't use the data diode in that case, it was just €70 for a Raspberry Pi with a nice little metal case. So that was sort of a full success. Unfortunately, still sort of like, that's when you start getting into politics. And, well, let's say politics killed that project. But unfortunately, what I have to say is all of the passive mode drivers we have, and those are currently sort of like Delta V and BuckNet IP, are only sort of in a proof of concept state. And those are because companies financed work on that, because they had an immediate need on having problem solved. So companies invested money, and we came up with these drivers, and they are part of the open source project. But as I mentioned, they're in a proof of concept state, and sort of like it needs a little bit of messing around with things to get them working. So we need you. And you, I'd say, is 2 parts. First of all, we need companies, because implementing these drivers is work. It's a lot of work, because you have to do a lot of guessing. You have to do a lot of analysis of communication patterns. It especially requires a setup that usual open source enthusiasts just don't have. Because in this case, you usually have a set of PLCs that are talking with a SCADA system, and I know nobody who privately owns a SCADA system to sort of run his house or something like that. Covering the costs currently it's just not possible at the moment. I was thinking of just going full self-employment in 2020. But it turns out sort of it's just not possible to sort of like survive as a freelancer just focusing on, let's say, PLC4X related development. It's just not possible. Even sort of I got into a little of trouble with the German tax offices because let's say they just don't like if companies sort of like systematically operate at a deficit, because I was sort of like every euro I was sort of like earning, I was just buying stuff, buying licenses, buying hardware. So working on these passive mode drivers, it makes things even worse. So we need help here. The industry can save hundreds, thousands, up to millions. I don't really care if it's dollars, euros, or whatever currency. It's just a lot of them that can be saved. And it's generally mostly the industry that would benefit from the existence of these drivers. So I think it would be a really great thing if the industry would help finance development. If you're interested in that, just join the Apache PLC4X mailing list and sort of like ask for help. There are a lot of people that would be willing to work on this. The community, well, you can always, we always need people to help coding. We need people to help testing things. Sometimes you don't even have to code. You just take our code, run it against your machinery, and and provide feedback on how it works. Sometimes we got things wrong, so it's really helpful if you get insights in where you got things wrong. Just talking about, if you hear somebody else sort of having a problem that PLC4X could solve, well, just speak about it. Tell them what we're doing. Get in contact with us, as I mentioned. Just send an email to the mailing list. Subscribing, just send an email to devsubscribe at plc4x.apache.org, or follow us on Twitter. We've got the Apache PLC4X Twitter account where we post interesting stuff about the project. So, where can you get more information? Well, Lucas already had a talk on PLC4X for CAN. You can see the recording. That's probably going to be available later on. I'm going to have 4 more talks in the next few months. One's going to be at ApacheCon on polyglot Apache PLC4X, sort of how we bring PLC4X to Java, C, Go, maybe Python, .NET, stuff like that. On the Linux Foundation OSS Summit, I'll be talking about embedded drivers for industrial communication with code generation. So how we're using code generation to build embedded drivers. There's a German IoT conference where I'll be talking about how to retrofit legacy production systems with PLC4X. And the last one so far this year is going to be high-performance ingestion of industrial production data at the EclipseCon this year. So this is the first time I'm going to be having this hat trick of speaking at all 3 big major foundations, but looking forward to it. And would be super happy on seeing some of you at one of those. So, thank you for listening. I hope it was interesting for you. And if you have any questions, well, don't ask me because I'm going to be, this is just a recording, but I'm going to be also sitting in the chat and probably going to go on stage after the talk to answer your questions. So don't hesitate, I don't bite, looking forward to interacting with you. Bye.